So this session is from PointFire, so I'm going to hand over to Martin Laplante, and all yours, Martin.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I have more than 30 minutes worth of material, so I will try to speak quickly, and I'll skip a couple of things, but later on, if you have some questions, I'd be glad to go into it in more details. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, there will be a demo of some of our products, but this is in the context of two different case studies that we did, one for a private sector company and one for a public sector department. Very different requirements, and I just wanted to highlight from this some of the best practices when it comes to governance for multilingual tenants. So we'll talk about some of the features that SharePoint already has in terms of multilingual page publishing, but some of what's missing and what we did for some of these customers. But the lessons that you draw from it in terms of governance for multilingual tenants are the same whether you're using our tools or not. So even if you have no intention of ever getting our tools, this is a useful session for you if you have more than one language in your SharePoint tenant. So why do you need translation in SharePoint? Well, for some multilingual countries like Canada or Belgium or Switzerland, there are two different languages or two or more different languages in the same country, and therefore for your employees at head office, you do need to support more than one language. There are some companies and some nonprofits that operate in different countries, and therefore in different countries, they will operate in different languages as well. But one of the things that's interesting is that even if all your employees in other countries speak English, there was an interesting study done. Prisoner's Dilemma is a bit of an experiment that you can do with people to see whether they choose a cooperative solution or a collaborative solution. And in foreigners who are asked to do this in English, will tend to choose the competitive solution, whereas when they're asked to do it in their own language, they will choose the collaborative solution. It's a very interesting result. So there are lots of benefits that you can have even among people who are able to speak English if you can provide content to them and collaboration to them in their own language. And there are some good features that you can have even out of the box. So the first one is it's an organization called Service New Brunswick. It's responsible for all of government IT, and this is Canada, and therefore government includes healthcare. There are legal requirements that all of their employees have the right to work in one language or the other, and therefore everything had to be available in both languages. They migrated from an older version of SharePoint on-premise to SharePoint 2019. This is when they adopted PointFire, and they are migrating to SharePoint Online later on. And the real challenge in this case was with the healthcare intranet that was being rolled out at the height of the COVID first wave. So just at the time when implementation was going on, as it was going live, the usage went up immensely. And what they're doing in the SharePoint site is some transactional data, very large tables, important things that have to be done, individual cases, and so forth. They ran into some performance issues because we've never done anything with quite such a volume, quite such a large table, which were quickly resolved. But in terms of governance, they were used to it. They were used to operating in two languages. I'll show you some of the results there and contrast them to what happened with a different case study, which is a multinational US-based company. And those are using SharePoint Online, PointFire Translator, PointFire 365, very large sites, large number of pages. And they needed to translate existing pages from English to 6 different languages. And there were 2 challenges. One of them is the startup translating legacy documents, legacy pages to multiple languages, and the other challenge was what do you do as new documents get created, because it's different people involved with the translating legacy data and the people who are generating data on a day-to-day basis. So this came at a time when the back end that PointFire Translator uses for machine translation, it was an Azure API, and Azure API was switching to a different version during the implementation. And what they were doing also at the same time is there are two different Azure APIs that you can use with PointFire Translator. One of them is the same engine for everyone, and it's a very high quality neural engine. But the other one is something called Custom Translator. Custom Translator is something that you can train on your own documents so that it adopts your vocabulary, your style. And they were using that for some of the languages because they had some distinctive vocabulary. So we discovered some bugs in the Azure API as this was rolling out. They were quickly ironed out. Some of the quirks that they have with certain languages, lesser used languages, that I guess Microsoft hadn't gotten to testing yet. What this particular case study taught us was not to be too ambitious on an initial implementation. As one a communications director there told us, she is suddenly responsible for 6 times as many documents as before, except that 90% of them she can't even read, she can't understand. And yet she's still responsible for them. There's still a lot to be done besides publishing a document. You have to take care of the entire life cycle, and therefore they had to figure out a new governance model when it came to things that were being translated, and figuring out who should approve them, and what are the retention policies. Are they the same? Do they get published at the same time as the original, or do they get published later on, and so forth? They also had to figure out the rules for continuing production of new pages when you create a new news release. What are the steps to make sure that is available in the other languages as appropriate? I talked before about the different versions and the custom translator. The quality of machine translation has gone up significantly and has been progressing very quickly. And it depends on the area that you're in. So in the automotive field, it goes higher as you go from standard translator to custom translator to the latest version of the custom translator. Whereas the things that it's normally trained on, which is office type documents, the quality increase that you get from custom training it is not quite as great. By the way, human beings, translators, tend to get a blur score of around the high 20s. So beyond that, once you get to the 40s, the score is sort of meaningless in terms of translation quality. You have to go to a different scale. We're getting to that point now in translation quality, where the old scales that we use to measure it are no longer useful because there are so few errors. There is a case for sometimes using human translators rather than machine translation. If you're a minority language speaker, it's unfortunate that they do not get the same treatment as majority language speaker, in that they get to see machine translated things rather than human produced content. And there has been a history of poor machine translation. Everyone knows about Google Translate, which in the public version was not very good, is still much lower quality than what you get with a paid machine translation engines like Translator API. And therefore, people may resent having to read machine translated copies. So human translators, besides the sensitivity, there is actually a difference in quality. Even though quality is high, the highest quality that you can get is with human translators. What you do want to have is a post-editing step. That is to say, after you translate something with machine translation, have somebody edit it to make sure that it is correct. There are certain types of text that you never want to have machine translation. If you know, this is a best practice. I mean, sometimes you do. Legal text should never be translated by machines. It's too important to get all the terms right. Medical text and so forth. Customer facing in general, you want to have that done by a human. So you have to balance the risk of errors with costs and the delays. One of the things that's happened as people move from SharePoint on-premise to SharePoint online is that you are moving from a physical fixed hierarchical topology to a flatter but logical and more flexible topology. And this has a big effect on your governance, on what you have to do, particularly when it comes to user interface. In the old classic on-premise model, there were hierarchies of different farms in different regions, and within that you had site collections and subsites and so forth. And if you were using a feature like variations, language was at the very bottom of the hierarchy. So something which is in a different language could be hived off to somebody who is regional and relatively lower down in the organizational hierarchy. Whereas with SharePoint Online, single tenant, it's our headquarters responsibility, because there's a number of things in this flat organization, like in the hubs, in the home sites, the global navigation and so forth. Those have to be localized, and these are things that are a headquarters responsibility, and it is the responsibility of headquarters to localize them. And it's no longer a regional responsibility that is lower down in the hierarchy. It's now at the very top of the hierarchy that you have to worry about it. So there's some features of SharePoint that are already multilingual, you probably know about the old variations. That's not so much a feature of SharePoint Online anymore. It doesn't work for modern pages, for instance. There's a new feature called multilingual page publishing that came out last year that works on certain types of pages. And the two other features of multilingual features of SharePoint are manage metadata, which can be multilingual, and the multilingual user interface, which is to say there are a number of user interface elements that can have different text in different languages. That includes navigations, site names, column headings, content type names, and so forth. And MUI has to be populated with different translations. This is not an easy thing to do, but once it's done, it's useful. It applies to everyone. When they go to the site in their language, they will see those user interface elements in their own language. So I'm going to give a quick demo of the multilingual page publishing feature, and at the same time, I'll give the PointFire translator demo, because I'm combining the two to be more efficient with the time. So here I have a modern page. It is on a modern site. I have the multilingual page publishing feature of SharePoint, the out-of-the-box one, turned on, and I'll show you how it works. So I have a page here called Working from Home. There is a button called Translation, and you'll notice this button says it's going to create a copy of this page for each language. It doesn't actually translate the page. It copies the page and then tells you you should translate it. So I will create the German version, and then I will go visit that version, and you see it's still in English. It says this page has not been translated into German yet. Edit to start translation. And if you look down here, the content is still in English. Somebody has to translate it to German. So this is how the SharePoint out-of-the-box feature works. The way that PointFire integrates with this is very simple. We have a flow with a custom connector, which says whenever these files are being created, these copies of pages, then it sends a command to PointFire translator saying translate this file in this library and so forth into the language that it should be in. So I'm going to go back to this tab and I've given it a few seconds. It should have worked. I will refresh the page, and PointFire Translator has replaced the content with the German version. It's done machine translation as soon as the page appeared, or within a few seconds. The user interface is still in the original in my language, in English, but the content is in German. It is possible to have the user interface in German, but that's somebody has to go and do some work and translate this. And my personal language preference has to be set to German. That takes too long to show in a demo. The SharePoint feature by itself does not handle MUI translation. It doesn't handle switching of your language. It has two separate parameters, one for user interface language and one for your content language preference. These are not necessarily the same. I find it a little confusing, but it's the way that the feature works. Okay. There are actually several different interfaces to PointFire Translator. I showed you the Power Automate. There's also an app where you can point it at a page and tell it to translate it. There's a web interface where you can point it at a site in a library and tell it to translate all the pages in this page library, command line, and so forth. PointFire Translator can also, besides translating these sorts of pages, it can also translate other modern pages on other types of sites that are not communication sites, translate classic pages, can translate Word documents, Excel, PowerPoint, metadata, list items, translates on OneDrive lists. So it can do pretty well any content translation of that you can put into SharePoint, and it can use either the human parity engines or the custom translator engines. Okay, so what is missing from multilingual page publishing? Machine translation, obviously, that's something that PointFire Translator I showed you it can do. It doesn't do team sites, classic sites, lists, libraries. You cannot author content in alternate languages. It doesn't do anything for the user interface. So all of this are things that are covered by another product that we have called PointFire 365, which handles the user interface, whereas PointFire Translator handles the content. So the user interface, I've told you a bit about it. That includes navigation, headers, footers. It includes other types of navigations, hub navigation, global navigation, all these new features that Microsoft is bringing out, they're rolling out right now. So all of these can be handled by PointFire 365. So I'll show you what this looks like very quickly. So I have a page here. I've set my language to French. My user interface is in French. My content is in French. What I'm going to do, PointFire 365 gives me the option to change my language preference. Both content and user interface language preference are always synchronized together. So I'm going to change this to English, and without leaving the page, now my user interface is in English, my content is in English. I'm on the same page. If you want to have a quick look at how it's done in this particular instance, what I'm doing is there are two different versions of the content on the page, and this web part has been tagged. PointFire is able to tag web parts to display this one only in English, and this other one will display only in French. Okay. So you can do that with web parts, tag them by language. You can tag documents by language. So if I go to a document library, while my language is English, I'm going to see English documents. If I go to the same document library while my language is French, then what I'm going to see, I didn't close the previous page properly. What I'm going to see is documents that are in French. In actual fact, all my documents and all my languages are in the same library, in the same places, in the root of the library and so forth. But the content of I have French documents, I have English documents, and they have been translated using PointFire Translator. Whenever I create a document in English, I tell PointFire Translator, translate this to English, to French, to German, to Arabic, and so forth. And it does that, and then it filters my library according to my language. It does that to document libraries, to page libraries, to lists. I only see things that are in my own language. So if I go to the home page while my language is French, I see a French home page called accueil.aspx. But if I go to this very same one while my language is English, it's going to show me home.aspx, which in this case is being maintained as two separate pages, one English page, one French page. That makes it a lot easier for content authors. They only have to create content in their own language. Then another person or a process will translate it for them. It magically appears in all the other languages for people who have different languages. They never have to worry about language, even though if they want to, they can tag elements by language manually. If they don't want to, they just let the automation take care of it. For the user interface elements that I was talking about, there's something called translate the interface. It's a three-step process, which is to say there are 3 buttons to press. The first one goes through the entire site looking for any translatable user interface elements that are not yet translated. It puts them into a list. And it will suggest translations for each of those elements. And you can edit the translations if you want in the list. And step 3 is like step 1 backwards. It goes through the elements again, but this time it writes to them from the list the translated versions of those elements. So one-step process that will translate all the user interface elements, including navigation and so forth, for everyone. Okay, so this is the quick demo. The language toggle, tagging by language, and so forth. It supports all 50 languages that are supported by SharePoint. I'll tell you a little bit about the governance issues when it comes to localization and the governance issues when it comes to content. So there are certain things that have always been centralized. Certain user interface element translation, like manage metadata, tends to be a centralized function, and it's whoever is responsible for those term sets is also responsible for the translations. It's under their permissions that this is done. There is some machine translation available for managed metadata, but you have to collaborate with the people who require managed metadata in other languages to see what they want translated and what those translations should be. So this is a first instance of a common theme, which is shared governance, a shared pattern where the users of the data are also have to share in the governance when it comes to localization with the authors. Content types can be the same thing. Content types have names, they have descriptions. You want that to be those to be available in all the languages. I don't have time to get into the details of what inheritance does to you. You can inherit names and inherit descriptions, and you have to be careful about that inheritance. If you're localizing, you have to do things in a particular order. User interface can be translated, and every modern site is potentially multilingual. This is something that people don't realize. When you create a new modern site, it's going to create it with all the languages activated. This is different from what you used to do on premise. When you created a site, it would only have one language, and then you would have to add the other languages. Modern sites, you create them, all the languages are activated. They're potentially available in every language that any of the users have. So you should prepare the multilingual user interface whenever you create a site. For the content, you have to, well, the next slide is about content, so I'll tell you more about it. Hubs and global navigations can appear on any site that it belongs to that hub, and the user of the site and the site itself was not necessarily going to be in the same language. So you have to make sure that you translate the navigation for the hubs and for the home site that's used in global navigation. News, you should probably tag by language, because the news could be viewed on many different sites, and there could be some language filtering there. So make sure that there's a way of tagging news by language. Localization is not something that can be left to regions anymore. So headquarters has to be involved in the strategy for localization. And those who are responsible for creating user interface text are also responsible for the translation of that text. But you have to do it in collaboration with the people who use that text. And this is where it gets difficult. You have to decide what needs translating and when. For user interface, it's a simple decision. For content, it's more difficult. And you have to also decide what is the level of quality that is required and how to achieve it. Is it going to be used with machine translation? Or are you going to use your own staff? Or are you going to use professionals? And there are increasing levels of cost and increasing levels of quality when you do that. Is it the people who generate content who are responsible for translation? Or is it going to be somebody else? When do you approve the translation as opposed to when you approve the original? Are they published at the same time, or do you publish the original first and then later on publish the translations in their good time? And if you're using your own staff, you never know when they're going to get around to translating the things that they're asked to translate. And that's one other thing which is very important, is if you're using your own staff, you have to be conscious of the load that you're putting on them when you're saying, oh, you know Korean, could you check all these Korean translations? Is it really part of their job? Right? Is the fact of having a different culture mean that you get to do extra work that is of no help to your career? So you have to think these things through before you put the load on your colleagues to do translation or to check translations. Should you translate selectively? So should you translate by policy or translate by request? Short answer is never translate by request. Always translate by policy. Translating by request means that some individual somewhere is responsible for creating work for their colleagues. And when they do that, there's going to be a long delay before the document that they need for their work is available to them. It's always better to be transparent and open about the policy and what gets translated and when it gets translated, and always translate it before people need it, not when they request it. And again, collaborative governance between content generators and consumers. So I will leave a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you very much for joining me. I will have a peek at the chat to see if there's any questions.
I haven't seen any questions come in, Martin.
Okay. In the 1 or 2 minutes that I have left, I can tell you a little bit more about some of the features that I skipped over. I said that there is nothing in the multilingual page publishing feature to assist when you modify the original document. There is in fact a way to do that, which is the version history. You can highlight what's been changed, and that can be very useful if you're using colleagues to do translation. Is there any? And the term store. This is relatively recent. This interface to the term store. I think it's just a few months old. The term store has now a much easier way to enter translations in different languages. It's on one page rather than having to switch a term store's language and then do the translation without seeing the other version. Anyway, that's about all the time that I have. So I will skip the rest. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending. if you want to go to the PointFire channel, I'm going to be there to answer any questions and to show any other features that you want to see, or just to chat.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Martin.
My pleasure. Thank you for moderating.